I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, coming up on Football Today. In 2016, as Hull City were preparing for a season back in the Premier League, fans were calling for the end of Assem Allam's ownership of the club.
We want Allam! We want Allam! We want Allam! We want Allam! We want Allam!
Now, 4 years later, the club sit in 21st place, facing possible relegation to League One. Attendances are at a new low, and the club haven't won since January. To make matters worse, the club recently banned the Hull Daily Mail from attending their latest home match against Charlton and publicly condemned an investigation by The Athletic. Today, we speak with The Athletic's Adam Crafton and ask, why is Hull City at war with the media? Let's start at the beginning. You wrote a 7,000 plus word deep investigation in The Athletic recently about Hull. What made you want to investigate Hull in the first place?
We actually started looking into the club before lockdown and before the pandemic really took hold in the UK. It was really due to their poor form in the Championship. I think they'd lost something like 9 of 11 games. They were sliding down the table. They'd sold their 2 best players in January, and Jared Bowen to West Ham and Kamil Grosicki to West Brom. So it felt like there could be a story there. And we're obviously aware that over the years there's been issues between the fan base and the Allam ownership at Hull City over the attempted name change to Hull Tigers, for example. But we just felt it would be a good time to take a fresh look at it.
And so how did the reporting kind of unfold after you initially decided you wanted to have a look at it?
For those of your listeners who subscribe to The Athletic, they'll know that often on these kind of pieces, there'll be 5, 6, sometimes more names on the byline of the piece. And that's because we're very lucky. We've got quite a huge pool of writers who all have different contacts. And my view when leading with these pieces, it's always best to let people who know a contact best call those contacts or those agents or those players or whoever it is and try and get as much information as possible. And then we bring it all together and balance it out. And that tends to be the best way to go about it.
And so what did you discover in your reporting of this story?
Well, quite a lot. I think, the main points are there is huge friction between the fan base and the ownership. That goes back to the attempt, I think, in 2013 to change the club's name from Hull City AFC to Hull Tigers.
So at Hull City, they're going to change their name. They're going to be the Hull Tigers.
I hate it. I think Steve Bruce is playing a fantastic diplomatic job at the moment, trying to tip-tap round it, trying to keep the fans happy, trying to appease the owner, but realises ultimately it's probably not a great decision. Other people will look at it and say, what's the big deal? Doesn't matter. The club's still there, isn't it? This guy saved the club. What you're all moaning about. But I still come back to ultimately the club belongs to the... Whether he's the owner and he's pumped millions in, the club belongs to fans, and I think the fans should have been able to have a vote on it or a discussion. This is the trouble with owners these days.
The argument for this from Assem Allam, the owner, was that basically the shorter the name you have, the easier it is to market. And this was something that he'd struck upon while reading a piece in the Harvard Business Review. And then on top of it, there was a dispute with the council over whether Hull City would be able to buy the stadium from the council. The council refused the offer. And there is a theory which the former chief executive, Nick Thompson, says in the piece. The owner of Hull was so annoyed that the council refused the offer that he then decided it would be best to take the word city out of Hull's name. So there was that sort of twin tractor view at the time. And then it all comes through to the present day. There was, in 2016, Hull were promoted to the Premier League, but it went disastrously wrong. Their manager, Steve Bruce, left before the season even started. They then got relegated, and since then it's been a gentle downward spiral, players being sold off, and unfortunately, you now see the club sliding towards the 3rd division for the first time in 15 years.
So you collect all this reporting from the numerous reporters, you bring it to the recent day, and then you and your colleagues send it off to Hull for comment. Can you kind of explain why you did that and the normal procedure for asking clubs for comment and how it usually goes?
Yeah, of course. We did that because the way to practice is that if you're going to write things about people that may be perceived as negative, then you give them fair comment, the fair opportunities to comment. I know that those who have read the Hull City statement will have seen that we sent the email at 12:34. It was actually 12:33 on my email account, but anyway. We sent that email to the club, and we gave them the remainder of Friday as well as the full weekend to respond. But these deadlines are often flexible. I actually, spoke to someone from Hull City on the phone on Friday, and we were very much of the position that if Hull would have come back to us on Monday and said, we're taking this really seriously and we want a couple more days to reply, we'd have done that. When I did an investigation into Birmingham City a few months ago, I think we twice extended deadlines to give the club a fair opportunity to comment. So that wouldn't have been an issue at all. And, I think if we're being honest, I think that the issue that the club had was less about the timing and probably far more about the content.
So how did Hull respond to your story?
Well, Hull responded to the story by sending an email to us at, I think, 9:58 on Monday morning, which was a statement basically defending the owner's position in terms of trying to make the club as financially sustainable as possible, and also a bit of an attack on our content, but it didn't deal with any of the individual points. Then about 3 minutes later, they tweeted a statement on their own club website, which was the same as what they'd sent in the email. But in addition to that, they also took the decision to publish my full email of allegations as well as their response.
With the irony that the redacted elements of that were actually visible to everyone who was watching online because you could just copy and paste it.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty extraordinary. I've never seen that. I mean, I've never actually seen a football club publish allegations before an organisation has published them. That's the first thing, and I think that's, it was obviously a very entertaining thing. And look, from our point of view, it ended up just being really, really good advertising for a piece that we'd worked really hard on over a period of time. So it wasn't the end of the world. However, if a football club or any organisation was to start taking that approach generally with journalists, they'd end up in quite a difficult situation, because journalists in future just would not go to them for comment in written form because they'd be very nervous about the information being leaked pre-publication.
So after their response, where were you when that came in, and what was your reaction?
I was exactly where I am now, which is at my desk at home. And it was actually quite funny because their initial statement came in via the email, and my instant reaction to that was actually quite pleased, because they didn't deal with any of the individual allegations. They didn't directly deny anything. They just sort of called the whole email tittle-tattle and misleading. So when you're a journalist and you receive that, you think, they've not really dealt with anything here, which means we can probably publish quite a lot of it. So I was quite happy. Then the statement dropped, and I think, for 10 or 15 minutes, you're a bit worked up and angry, but then, you calm yourself down and think, okay, well, let's see how this plays out over the next couple of hours online, on social. And it was very, very quickly clear that the supporters of the club did not respond to it, perhaps in the way that Hull expected.
What do you think they expected?
I think they probably expected, and it's only my interpretation, but I think they probably expected that sense of, a bit like when a Trump or a political party make a statement online to try and call out journalists, and it can whip up support for the institution and whip up a bit of outrage against a journalist or news organisation. And it just didn't work out like that at all. And I think that is because of this, real degradation of the relationship between the fan base and the owners over almost a decade now.
We'll get to that in a minute, but you're not the only media member that's had some issues with the club. The club recently banished the Hull Daily Mail from attending games and press conferences. Have you spoken with anyone there?
Yeah, I dropped a message to, there's the Hull City reporter, Phil Buckingham, who works for the Hull Daily Mail. I actually dropped him a message on Monday because on our list of allegations, one of them was that they'd banned the Hull Daily Mail. And that came from an entirely different source. But I was a bit anxious that the fact that the club had leaked that email and shown that before the Hull Daily Mail had actually dealt with it themselves or revealed it themselves. I was a bit disappointed by that, so I just got in touch with them almost to apologise on Hull's behalf for revealing that information. However, later that morning, the Hull Daily Mail then put out their own statement outlining that they'd been banned, as well as Hull Live, the website. I mean, it doesn't If Hull City are angry with a British American publication like The Athletic, it's not ideal, but I think it's really damaging when it then becomes a local organisation like the Hull Daily Mail, because you're then actually depriving your region and your local supporters of key information. And I think that's wrong, and I think that's something that the club should deal with and correct pretty urgently.
What does their response to you and to the Hull Daily Mail tell you about the club?
I think it spoke for a sense of panic at the club at the moment. It must be an incredibly difficult feeling as an owner when your team is sliding down the table, you've sold your best players. I think they probably thought in January, because I think there was a time at the start of January where Hull were only a couple of points off the playoff positions. So they probably presumed in January when they cashed in on Bowen. Bowen was an initial £18 million. It's a good deal. The problem is they didn't replace these players. So I think at that stage they probably thought, okay, we may slide down the table a bit, but we'll be all right. But clearly that situation has spiralled. And I think, the response speaks for a sense of panic, a loss of control over a situation. And also there has been negative publicity for the club because, when you are a club that's up for sale but unable to be sold, when you are a club that is losing games repeatedly, when you are a club whose captain and vice-captain walked out on the club in the week leading up to the restart of the season, there's going to be questions. And not every club likes to hear questions.
Are you a fan of football today? Then why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full interviews, and extra content. Just go on Patreon and search Football Today. Now, back to the episode. Earlier, you alluded to the issues they have in terms of relationships with various stakeholders. It's not just the press, but fans, players, coaches, and as you said earlier, the local council. What do you make of their issues with maintaining relationships with those important stakeholders?
I think it's a big shame. I think it's mostly a big shame because if you actually examine the Allam ownership at Hull City, the record over the 8 or 9 years they've owned the club. I mean, when they took over the club, there was a winding up order against the club. There was huge bills that needed to be paid.
When Hull City faced the threat of liquidation in 2010, there was genuine fear that over 100 years of history would be wiped from the footballing archives. But in the club's greatest hour of need, one man emerged from the shadows to save the Tigers from extinction.
And the Allam family, through loans, it should be said, from themselves to the club, in essence saved the club. And then they've had 3 years in the Premier League under this ownership. They've reached an FA Cup final.
Quinn, good play from him. And it's nearly 2, and it is! It's Curtis Davis this time. The defenders are doing the job, and Arsenal have got no defence against them. This is the FA Cup. You better believe it.
They've had some really fantastic players at the club. They've done some very good deals, buying and selling players like Andrew Robertson, Harry Maguire, bringing through Jared Bowen and selling him for good money. It's by no means is it all being very bleak. And on top of that, it is true that the club is in many ways financially sustainable in what is a chaotic division financially. And then on top of that, you've got big investment in the local area, in cancer research facilities, in the local university. So there should be a really good relationship between the owners and the fans, but through a series of actions over a number of years, that relationship has been ruined. And it's a huge shame. Why is it? Well, with regards to the council, there was a disagreement over the stadium. The stadium is still owned by the council, but is run by a stadium management company owned by the owners of Hull City. And then you have the different relationships with, managers like Steve Bruce. Steve Bruce, you don't hear about him having wild rows with owners generally, but in this case, it's as toxic as I've ever heard between a vice chairman and a manager. Nigel Adkins, last year, he'd done a pretty good job at Hull last season, but he decided not to stay and hasn't had a job since. So it's not like he was walking out of Hull into another really good job. So clearly there are issues that have manifested over a number of years, and then you see it with the players as well.
I saw someone on Twitter compare the Allam family to Mike Ashley. Do you think that's fair?
I wouldn't compare them to Mike Ashley in terms of, a comparison to Mike Ashley is a big thing in terms of everything it encompasses, in terms of the way that he's treated workers at different points and things like that. I think where it's a fair point is the sense that both Newcastle and Hull, under their current ownerships, have actually been run from a financial point of view quite sensibly. It's not a case of, wild wages to turnover ratios and things like that. But what those owners have done at the same time is they've stripped the club of hope, I think, and that's a very sad thing. And they've stripped the clubs of assets at different times. I think Hull have actually done that more severely than Newcastle over the last few years. And it's one of the things, like, Hull at the moment are up for sale, but they're trying to sell a club that does not own its own stadium, that has no playing assets really left to sell of significant value. And it's not that appealing as a prospect anymore. The wages that they're proposing to offer to players this summer, I've been told, are between £4,000 per week to £7,000 per week at the top, even if they stay in the Championship. So, you're talking about real cost cutting, and in essence, just it feels at the moment, according to their supporters, as though the owners are using whatever's left at the club really to pay back loans that the owners are owed.
It's interesting you say that, hope is kind of the big thing missing. Are Hull proof that winning or sporting success isn't everything? Kind of in the last decade, as you pointed out, you've had some pretty big achievements for a club that size.
You have, but I think you have to maybe divide it up into sections, because I think there was a real turning point in 2016. 2016, Hull City, they get promoted. They beat Sheffield Wednesday in the playoff final.
The Hull City fans will jump for joy because they are back in the Barclays Premier League.
And that was an inflection point. That summer was an opportunity which they completely spurned. And there's complications in that there was several takeovers that very nearly happened but didn't happen that summer. And what happened as a result was the playing squad was, I think it was down to 13 fit players at the start of the season when Mike Phelan was in charge. And they started the Premier League that way. So they lost their chance to potentially become, some sort of stable Premier League club because they went back down again. So I think that's a shame. And since that summer, it's been gradual selling off of playing assets, really just trying to hang into mid-table in the Championship. That's how it's appeared to me from the outside. And, now they're in a real difficulty because, this is probably the worst ever year to be relegated from the Championship into a league. League One at the moment is a league that does not exist. There's no clarity at the moment as to when that league restarts, how that restarts, what the financial situation is going to be for clubs in that league without supporters able to attend games.
In the article, you talk about how financially prudent they are numerous times, and even in their response to you, they pointed out how important it is for them to be financially prudent. Do you think that they're kind of a casualty of the Championship business model, which incentivizes and encourages clubs to overspend?
For sure, absolutely. I think there was 2 clubs that made both pre- and post-tax operating profits for the 2018-19 season in the Championship. Hull were one, Rotherham were another. So, for sure, but that's why the profit and sustainability regulations came in and things like that over the last few years to try and help that situation. I think what I would say is, I think sometimes in football there is maybe a little bit too much made of football clubs having to make a profit all the time. A lot of very successful companies will take loans out as part of a long-term sustainable plan. You don't always have to be in profit at that particular moment in time. So I think you do have to balance that against their argument. And in addition to that, I think you have to also balance it between there is a point at which being prudent financially is damaging to the long-term prospective finances of the company.
So what you're kind of implying is that they've been quite short-term in their thinking?
Yeah, I think they have been. I think they have, because I think what they've tried to do is ensure that as much of the loans that are owed to the family are able to be paid back. And the most effective way of doing that is through player sales, which they are absolutely entitled to do as a family that have put a huge amount of loans into the club, have attempted repeatedly to sell the club but not quite been able to. But I think it's clear that's what they've been doing over the past few years. But every time they do that, and every time a player goes and is not adequately replaced, actually the valuation of the club falls again. But at the same time, their asking price doesn't seem to be falling. So it leaves them locked in what's quite an unhappy relationship with this club. And at the same time, the valuation continues to drift, and the club probably continues to drift down the divisions.
Is that what you see happening in the future?
Well, I mean, it's hard to see a different situation at the moment, unless... So if you take this season, for example, I mean, there is a possibility they stay up this season. It probably won't be based on their own form, because the form is awful at the moment, and they've lost not only key players in January, but they've lost a series of players who were due to be out of contracts on June the 30th, including the captain Eric Lehigh, vice-captain Jackson Irvine. These are two big players for the club as well. But where they do potentially have a ray of light is that there's quite a few clubs down there. So obviously you've got Barnsley and Luton at the bottom, but there's also Middlesbrough, there's Stoke, I think Huddersfield are down there. And there's also an interesting situation with Sheffield Wednesday, who may yet be deducted points over an EFL investigation. So they could be dragged into it as well. You've also got Charlton, who have been in chaos down there. So it's not unfeasible that they get away with it. However, if they were to go down to League One, I would really worry for them, because I imagine the budget would be cut even more. They'd probably have to sell again a couple of players if they want to be in profit. The broadcasting revenue drops off if you're in League One as well. And the other thing is their match day income isn't great, because even before the pandemic, fans had stopped coming. I think it was 25,000 were there to see them beat Liverpool in 2017, and 9,000 were there to see them beat Preston, I think it was, earlier this season. It's that's almost a threefold drop off. So match day income, even without a pandemic, isn't great. So if their aim is always to be in profit, then that's going to be really difficult.
What did writing this speech teach you about owning a club in 2020?
Don't own one. I mean, particularly in the Championship. I mean, I think in the Championship, it's a really difficult place to own a club now, because if you go down this current Hull route of we want to be a business that aims to be in profit, a business that aims to be sustainable both in the short term, then that's a really hard ask if you also want to be competitive. On the flip side, if you are, say the Saudis, for example, wanted to buy out a Championship club and do a bit of like what Man City did at the start, 12 years ago now, then you can't do that in the Championship anymore because of the financial fair play regulations. You can't just go in and spend all your own money willy-nilly. So it means really you're almost in this halfway house where you can sort of invest a bit, but not really go for it. And on the other side of it, if you want to try and run a business really, really prudently, you're probably going to get relegated.
Adam Crafton is a football journalist for The Athletic, and for more information on this topic, you can read his piece titled Special Investigation: The Story of Hull City's Decline. This episode was produced by John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. And before you go, if you're a Patreon VIP subscriber, tonight we're having another group Zoom chat, so don't forget to come by and talk with us. And if you're not a Patreon subscriber, sign up now and get bonus episodes and extra content.